do it. Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really just a conversation. There's only basically two questions that I always ask, and the first one I feel is like the biggest question of all. Who are you?
Same as you. One consciousness manifesting as infinite possibilities. I guess I can give you my abridged life story. Does that work?
Yeah, whatever you want. I mean, it's there's no right or wrong answer, and yeah, the logistics are always nice, name and location, but
oh, you don't know my name. That's right.
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, it's Chiara, correct?
Yeah, you said it right too. A lot of people think it's like Chiara. I've gotten Chair, Shakira, Chianti, so all kinds of things, but it's Chiara with a hard C.
Nice.
Yeah. So my name is Chiara. I was born and raised in Orange County, California, which was not really my vibe or my tribe. So pretty much the minute I turned 18, I moved cross country to Roanoke, Virginia, where I went to an all-women's university called Hollins. And as much as I loved school, it again wasn't really my vibe or my tribe. It was like 800 radical, angry lesbians just marinating in the woods of Virginia. And it wasn't like, I'm totally LGBTQA plus friendly. The part that was difficult for me was politically, things were really charged on campus at that time. I graduated in 2016. And because I'm like an emotional sponge, it's difficult for me to be around people who are very upset all the time. And that was a lot of my experience on campus socially. So also years like 17, my late teens and my early 20s were difficult. It was kind of like one major life challenge after another. And it had this kind of cascading effect to the point where I was not in a good headspace mentally or emotionally. And so I got to the point where I called my parents and I was like, I want to drop out of college. Like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And they said no. And because I've always listened to my parents, I was like, okay, so I guess I'm stuck here, but I can't do, like, I knew that for myself, I couldn't go through 4 years. And I also didn't feel like I could, it almost felt like betraying my parents and their expectations of me. I look at those things differently now, but at the time that was very much the way I saw the world. And so my middle ground was to double up on classes and graduate early. And so I averaged like 7 classes a semester, graduated a year early, and moved to Thailand. Because like I said, I wasn't in the greatest mental and emotional space, and Western modalities hadn't worked for me. I was in and out of therapy since I was like 10. And so I was like, what can I do? And I developed an interest in Buddhism. Growing up, my mom was very much into the like Eastern philosophy. I guess she gave me my first copy of the Tao Te Ching when I was like 8. Not that I understood it. I still only understand like 80% of it, or don't understand like 80% of that book. But
as it should be.
Yeah, right. You can always go back to it and puzzle over something. So it's wonderful. And so growing up, I had like a lot of her influence, and she's very interested in Eastern religions and philosophies. And my favorite professor in college was very formative that way too. She taught all the Buddhist classes. And so when it came time to graduate, I decided that I was going to teach abroad, and I wanted to do it somewhere Buddhist. And as I was looking at the options, I was really interested in Thailand, because their flavor of Buddhism is like a mixture of Buddhism and Hinduism. It's got some Taoism, it has some animism. And so it really is just this melting pot of, it almost cherry picks the spirituality there. And it's not so much a religion as it is a lifestyle. Like the entire culture is steeped in Buddhism. And so I decided that that was where I wanted to go. And I ended up in a tiny town called Chiang Kham, right on the Lao border. And I taught English and studied Muay Thai for about a year. And then I was also blogging at the time, which is how I got my start in freelance writing. Came home, started a sole proprietorship, and I did that freelance writing for about a year, and then ended up in project management for tech and software, which is what I do now. So kind of circuitous, but here we are.
Very cool. I've been watching your series on spiritual awakening. As you can probably tell, I've been commenting on some of your videos and loving it, obviously. But there was something that caught me at the very beginning of part 1, something that you mentioned. And I appreciate the analytical lens that you bring to your videos, but I'm looking for the actual story here. What happened to you in 2017?
Okay, yeah, that's a story. So as a teacher, teaching in Thailand, you get a couple months off. And I had a big bucket list of things that I wanted to do. And one of those things was a 10-day silent meditation retreat, a Vipassana retreat. And the one that I chose at Suwon is very stringent. It's very ascetic. And so you sleep on like a marble bed, like a stone bed thing with like a wood pillow. You meditate from 12:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night. You eat a bowl of rice. It's insane. And I had meditated like off and on for a lot of my life, but I just kind of went from 0 to 100, like jumped way into the deep end. And not sure I would recommend that, because it definitely was, it was a difficult experience for me for a couple of reasons. One was it brought up a lot of things that I hadn't entirely processed. And two was, it was the first time I became aware of the voice in my head. Eckhart Tolle talks about it as being the ego, right? And the issue with this voice, this narrative, this story that we're always hearing in our heads is that we often identify with it and think that that's us. And there's a moment where you realize that you're actually what Eckhart Tolle calls the watcher behind the thinker. And that moment happened for me at the meditation camp, where I started to disassociate from this sort of like unhappy voice, this critical voice in my head. And I was like, that's not what I am. It's a story that I'm telling myself. And that pretty much is, I think, standard for people who meditate. You'll often have that experience of processing things mentally, emotionally, and then also the experience of becoming aware of your ego. And then there was another layer to this for me, which I guess some people would call a mystical experience. About a weekend, I got really sick. I had a rash all over my body, and I just generally felt ill. And so I went to the people at the camp, and I was like, I'm going to go see a doctor in Bangkok. So I signed out, caught a sleeper train to Bangkok. And as I'm falling asleep on the train, I start to go into this different kind of space, and like my throat closes, constricts. I feel like I can't breathe. Heart is pounding. My body feels like it's on fire. My hands go numb, and I'm convinced I'm dying. So long story made short, I make them stop the train in the middle of the jungle. They call an ambulance and they take me to a hospital, and they look me over and they're like, "You're fine. You're just on drugs." And I was like, "I'm not on drugs." Like that did not happen unless someone like slipped something in the freaking vegetable stew at the meditation camp. Like it didn't happen. But they couldn't find anything wrong with me, so they gave me a shot of antihistamines. I don't know why. And then they put me on a bus and continued on my way to Bangkok. And about 45 minutes into this, it starts to happen again, where I'm going into this just strange feeling of, I was just convinced I was going to die. It was like physically painful and mentally uncomfortable. And so because I was embarrassed about having made a scene on the train, I was like, I'm just going to go down to the bathroom and die quietly in peace, not disturb anyone. That was like literally my train of thought. And so I go down to the bathroom, and as if it isn't already trippy enough, again, not on drugs, but it does kind of feel like the way I've heard people describe psychedelics. This bathroom has mirrors for walls and for a ceiling. And so I sit down, the only place I can, on the toilet, and I'm in this state of feeling like I'm going to die. And it looks like there's just infinite reflections on every side of me. And again, convinced I'm going to die. And I think back to one of the things that the monk said at the meditation camp, which is that if you focus intently enough on your breath, you'll know what it feels like to take your last breath. And so part of, I think, meditation is preparing ourselves for what it would be like to die. And so I started to focus on my breath. And as this happened, it was sort of like being in two places at once. On one hand, there was me sitting in this bathroom, feeling like I was going to die and meditating. And, you know, normally consciousness feels like it's centered like right here, like right behind your eyes. You're like a little pilot, right between your eyebrows or something. And it felt like expanding sort of like upwards and outwards, and was looking down at myself, and watched as it wasn't like a hallucination, like it wasn't intense, but it was almost dreamlike, like being in a waking dream, where there was a version of me sitting up, there was me, like my physical body, and then this version of me that would fall out onto the floor and kind of like dissipate into the floorboards, and then it would happen again and again. And I was just up here watching this happen for what turned out to be 2 hours, because what snapped me out of it was someone knocking on the bathroom door being like, "Hey, we're in Bangkok." And I get off the train and I'm absolutely hysterical. Like, because it completely rattled what I thought was real. And I was convinced that either I was dying or going crazy. It was just a very earth-shattering experience for me. And so someone takes me to the hospital. They look me up and down again. They're like, no, you're just on drugs. And so they give me a shot of antihistamines. I don't know what it was with antihistamines. And they sent me on my way. And I was so scared after that I couldn't leave my apartment for like 3 weeks. And I was supposed to go back and teach. And I ended up just catching a plane home and living with my parents for a while. And after that, for about 2 years, I had all kinds of weird physical symptoms, things that were seemingly unrelated. And I thought, like, again, I thought I was either going crazy after that experience or dying. And so I was like, I have a brain tumor or an autoimmune disorder or something. And so I was in and out of hospitals, seeing doctors, naturopaths, because the symptoms were very real. There was the possibility that it was just anxiety. Oh, and the other thing that I developed was panic attacks, which I had never had before. And so I thought, there's the possibility that it was just, I'd suddenly developed anxiety and panic attacks, but there were like a slew of physical symptoms too, where I would get boils on my body. I would get rashes. I would again have these fits where it felt like my entire body was on fire. There was a summer I woke up and I couldn't turn my head. It was like, this was all paralyzed. It was like waking up with whiplash. I would have dizzy spells where I would see flashing lights and I would go deaf in my left ear and like fall over. It was really strange. And so I was convinced that it was something neurological or autoimmune. And it wasn't until I always wondered if it might have some sort of like psychospiritual or energetic cause, because what had triggered it was the meditation camp. But I still couldn't really reconcile this experience that I had had with what I believed reality was, having like come out of my body, right? And so it was sort of this tug of war for like 2 years where I was like, well, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe that was a real experience and what I'm experiencing is kind of the fallout from that. Or maybe I'm crazy. And it wasn't until I really started seriously considering that it had like a spiritual cause that I stopped having panic attacks and the physical symptoms went away, which was really strange. And at that point, that's when I really took the dive into what a spiritual awakening is. And I haven't figured out all the pieces. It's kind of what I'm in the process of, and sort of sharing what I find as I go on IdeaSexx. But that was the experience, and what it's led me to is really wanting to connect these mystical and spiritual experiences with evidence, with data, with any kind of science I can get my hands on. And obviously, like, this isn't something that's studied in the mainstream, so it's taken me some kind of fringe places, but it's exciting. I've been tumbling down the rabbit hole for a while now.
And it basically all came from that one experience and the fallout from that experience. That's what sent you searching for answers, basically.
Yeah, I would say I've probably been sort of existential my whole life. And so in a way, that was the best thing that could have happened to me, to be like, oh shit, like I am more than a human body. And these thoughts, like there is something that I really do at this point feel like life has these mystical underpinnings. And so for me, it was kind of magical. That's not how I saw it at the time, certainly. But I would say for most of my life, I was looking for answers. And I would say that experience was sort of the start of an answer, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. So before that, when you say you were always kind of looking for answers, what was driving that search, do you think?
I would say just general existentialism. I think even as a really young kid, it's the big questions, right? It's asking like, why are we here? What is the purpose of this? And, a lot of times people will tell you, especially like a kid growing up, that there aren't answers to those things, or that you have to, I don't know, it can very easily spin off into like, what is the word I'm looking for? Like nihilism, like believing that there's nothing beyond this. And that never really sat well with me. And so I would say I had an interest in philosophy. I had an interest in religion, and looked for answers in different places. Yeah. What was the question again?
I don't remember. Before your experience, what drove your curiosity or your search for answers? But I've been having these conversations with people for a little while now, and not just on the podcast, obviously, I mean, in real life. And I've met enough people who have gone through similar experiences now that I'm seeing a lot of like milestones or parallels, or like even with my own experiences, what you're telling me right now, I'm like, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. My experience wasn't like your experience at all, but it had the exact same effect on me. It made me realize that, number one, everything I thought I knew, no longer certain, because I had this experience that just kind of similar to you, opened me up to new possibilities that I never even considered, right? And that's what triggered my search. And that's, that was 7 or 8 years ago, and I haven't stopped, and in terms of knowing what it is or finding answers, I have not found it. I have found answers, but they were not the answers that I thought I was going to find, nothing definite. It's all just kind of like references to kind of keep my own experiences in context, right? But yeah, very similar. And the fact that you were curious before and that this happened to you, to me, doesn't seem like a coincidence.
No, it's synchronicity, totally. So for you, was your, I call it a moment of awakening, because it's usually like a moment, like something triggers this in people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the themes that I've noticed too, looking through people's like anecdotes and other people who have tried to map this experience. For you, was it the construction job?
That was definitely a seed, for sure. That was when I first realized that things are not objectively as they seem. Like there's no, like basically that's when I first became aware that my opinion on things was something that I could shift and control, and that by changing it, it would change my experience. And I was like, whoa, that was a big life hack at the time. That's all it was a life hack. And it was like I only used it in work settings because I had, again, grueling physical shitty jobs. So
Yeah.
but it never broadened out, but I'm sure that was a part of it. But the experience that really kicked it off for me was in 2013, and I call it my Cubicle Epiphany. And I was working for the same company at a cubicle, and I literally just started asking myself questions about like humankind and like, why is the world the way it is? And I was just trying to like make sense of things. And I've essentially thought my way out of thinking. Like I got to a place in my mind that I'd never been to before, and it was just can't really describe it. It was like so simple, so clear. Everything made sense. Everything clicked. I felt euphoria. Thought I was on drugs as well. Had the same question as you. I was like, did somebody put ecstasy in my water? Like that would not be a cool prank to play at your, on your colleague, because I've done these substances in my life, and I'm aware of how they feel. And I felt so blissful and euphoric, and there was no cause for it. I was like, what's happening? Am I going crazy? Did I get drugged? But then, I just started immediately looking into it, because I was like, what's happening to me? And again, synchronicities abounded, and I found lots of things that just kind of led me on my way. And now I'm a lot more comfortable with it. I still don't know what the fuck's going on, but I'm comfortable with that. And I know that that's kind of like the best you can hope for, is to realize none of us really know. We're just kind of throwing darts in the dark at this point.
And I think a huge part of the journey too is surrender. Like so often, especially when we're operating out of our egoic mind, we want control and we want certainty, and we want to know the way things are going to go and try to predict the future. And so much of awakening for me has been sort of letting go and just letting things happen. And when you do that, I feel like you come more into alignment, you experience more synchronicity, and things kind of just fall into place. So that part resonates with me. And I also think it's really interesting that being stuck in a cubicle is what brought on that epiphany for you.
Well, and it really had nothing to do with the setting. I don't think it really had everything to do with my thought process at the time. Like I don't even remember what I was thinking about, but I was thinking about big topics. Like my mind was on something, and I was following it along, and then it brought me to this place that was like I couldn't describe anymore. It just all made sense.
Did you like being in an office like that though?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like my job. I still work for the same company. I still work in a job. I'm not in a cubicle anymore, but I still have the same idea. Yeah, so my hurdles with work, I overcame that in construction. After that sort of realization that work is what you make it. I haven't had any issues really with life satisfaction around work since then. But I had the kind of job that allowed me to listen to podcasts. It was kind of like a lot of mindless work. And so I think I was just filling my head up with a lot of different ideas, and everything just kind of catalyzed in this weird moment. And it blew me away. And to this day, it's one of the most profound experiences I've ever had. And I've done psychedelics, and this blows all my psychedelic experiences out of the water by far.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was thinking that like for me personally, if I were to be trapped in a cubicle, and I had one job with a Cubicle. I lasted a month. I would have just driven myself insane. So that's where my head was at. But I see where you're coming from.
Yeah, it wasn't a dark night of the soul. Most of the people that I talk to, it's similar to kind of the experience that you described. There's fear, and maybe even sometimes it maybe even be triggered by misfortune. Like I have a buddy who lost everything in like a financial crisis, and that was his wake up call, right? He hit bottom.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, I just lucked out. I 100% lucked out because it was like pure bliss for 3 months. And I have a really bad, I have anger issues. I've had anger issues in my life, and for 3 months, I did not experience anger once. And I was like, holy shit, this is possible? Wow. I had never realized that you could live without anger or without resentment or all those things. It was completely wiped away for the longest time. But then it started to, things started to creep back in, right? Like old patterns eventually come back, right? So
that's interesting. I wonder why it's temporary when that happens. And I wonder if the goal then is to get back to that space. Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't know. That's a great question. And I've gone back and forth on it a bunch of times. Like, I don't know that I'll ever be to the point where I'm always like that, but I know that it's possible to bring yourself closer to that on a regular basis. Like anger now is not as much of an issue for me. And so I feel a lot of joy on a daily basis, which was, again, unusual. But I think what happens is people have the experience, they think they're good. And this is another pattern that I've noticed. They're like, I'm enlightened. And then they don't do anything about it. And then it's like, no. You've made a grave mistake, sir, madam, because the universe will smack you upside the head if you think that you've made it. You have to keep working every day, right?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that goes back to healing in a way. Mm-hmm. And that's constant maintenance. Like even when we get to a point where we're okay, it's like a lifelong thing. And it also, the idea of experiencing bliss just by being sounds like that is what mystics are. And that's the state that they try to attain. So it's interesting that we can get that for short periods of time. I think that's really fascinating. Wow. What an interesting way to come onto this journey. Were you interested in spirituality and the like before that?
Again, like you, I had interest in that. I mean, as a kid, I remember one conversation I had with my mom that was basically the like, what's the meaning of life conversation, but not in those words. And she was like, I was like, what are we supposed to do? Just go to school, work, and die? And she was like, yeah.
Okay. So, what's so interesting is I think part of a spiritual awakening is getting out of that mindset. I think that a huge part of this is seeing beyond our social conditioning, because we're literally taught that the trajectory for our lives is cradle, work, retirement, grave. And I don't think that inspires anyone. I think that I think freedom and creativity are our birthright. And it's something that's sort of almost like trained out of us. Like when you think of children being put at desks at like 3 or 4 and they're taught to listen to an authority figure, you're not really encouraged to ask a whole lot of questions. Everything's very conformist. And then the influence of like social media, of media. And by the time we're adults, we have all of these expectations and these ideas, these notions about what life is supposed to be like. And I think that in a spiritual awakening, we step away from that and look for something bigger. It's kind of like what you said earlier about like, you get the 9-to-5 job, you retire maybe at 65, get married, white picket fence, 2.5 kids. And I don't think that does it for a lot of people. I think like a lot of us need something more. And so that narrative, that mainstream narrative, that widely accepted narrative, I think some people can shoulder it for a while, but once you've had that moment of awakening and experience something bigger, like it's never going to be enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the people who shoulder it the longest are the ones who stay the busiest, because they never stop long enough to think about these things, right? They're always working, they're always mowing the lawn, they're always doing something, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, I think that's so true. And we do that all the time in the West. Because I think we really pride ourselves on things like productivity and making money and status. And so it's just this constant like hamster wheel that we get stuck on. And if you don't take a moment to stop and reflect, which for me happened through meditation, for you happens in a moment of bliss in a cubicle, I think we can stay on that little hamster wheel our whole lives. So
yeah.
No thanks.
Well, and it's not to say that it sounds like you and I are still on the hamster wheel in terms of our actual physical lives. Right? I mean, you're a project manager. I'm, managing a team for an insurance brokerage. So it's not like we're, we're sitting in meditation every day. But I think for me now, at least, the goal is to find bliss and sort of meaning in whatever I'm doing, right? Like if it's, if answering emails, whatever, if I'm doing it, I'm 100% in, and I'm just completely at one with whatever I'm doing. And
I think that's a very mature attitude. I've kind of gone in the other direction, where I'm determined now to create a lifestyle that I guess something sort of like chasing your dreams, I guess. Like I'm not ready to surrender to what I'm doing now. And I actually love my job. We're remote, we're flex time. I've got the most badass boss in the world. We're working toward like a 30-hour work week, and
nice.
it's really, yeah, it's magical. Like I'm happy with it. But ultimately, like I feel like we get one shot at being alive, and I kind of want to max out in whatever way is possible. So I actually really admire the fact that you, after having this experience, you're like, I'm going to find joy in whatever it is I do. I think that that is the most rational and like mature take on that. I wish I was at that point, but I feel badly, honestly. I just want to do something else, which is why I've got a couple side hustles that I work on. I've got ideas, and for the same reason that you do your podcast, right? Like even if it does feel good to go to work. And like, I'm in a similar place where I do enjoy my work and I can find joy in it. It's not what I would do if I didn't need the paycheck, right? If I didn't need the paycheck, I would just do IdeaSexx and read books.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's sort of a similar thing where, you may be happy with your job, but you still do the podcast, right? Because some part of you still need to feed that part of you, the
Absolutely.
part of you. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Exactly. Yeah. It's just, you got to fill your bucket, right? And my 9-to-5 job pays the bills, and I like it, and I try to immerse myself in it when I'm doing it, but I need something else. Absolutely. So I'm with you on that. I mean, if I didn't need a paycheck, wouldn't be doing what I'm doing 100%. But
just read marketing.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd be doing exactly the same thing you're describing, but because I do need the paycheck and I have this great job, and I feel very privileged to have it. I try to turn it into a spiritual exercise. Basically, everything that I have to do, from loading the dishwasher to answering emails or Excel spreadsheets or playing with my kids, whatever it is, everything has to become a spiritual exercise, and
like being present for it.
100%. Exactly. Yeah.
I have so much admiration for that, because I really struggle with it. I often find myself wanting to be somewhere else, and I catch myself doing that all the time. So that would be a good thing. Do you have any tips for that? Like, do you just have to constantly remind yourself?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not something that I've, even though I've been on this path for 7 or 8 years now, all of this stuff that I'm talking about now with making everything sort of a spiritual exercise is very recent. Same with surrender, actually. Surrendering and letting go and all that stuff is stuff that I'm only coming to around now, to be honest. In the last year or so, I've really come to appreciate and realize the power of surrender and what it even means, right? Because I think we have this connotation, especially in the West, where it's surrender. Fuck that. I'm gonna fight.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
and it's like, no, it's not what we're talking about. It's submitting yourself to the highest power in the entire universe. It's not like you're submitting or surrendering to a person or an authority, it's like it's the authority. You're putting yourself in alignment with that. So yeah, it's taken me a long time to get to that. But and just to be clear, this whole everything is a spiritual exercise thing, that's my goal. I'm not achieving that.
I get you.
Like you, I'm like what's happening in the news. I get distracted and stuff, but it's just become more of a central focus for me. So, yeah. Any tips? Constant reminders. I surround like this is my office, and I've got stuff everywhere that no matter where I look, it's like, oh yeah, okay, be present, right? Because if you don't, the mind, 30, 40 years of conditioning, good luck overcoming that in a few years, right? You need to constantly train it and bring it back to the present moment, because it's always like, oh, there it goes. Oh, there it goes. Right?
You got to keep it on a leash. You're
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, but it's work. That's all it is. Just my advice is just keep doing the work, and it just gets a little bit easier, hopefully.
It's like meditation. Yeah. You just got to keep bringing yourself back to your breath, back to your center. Yeah. I think, so many of the when you're asking the big questions, and we kind of have this like inkling of an answer. It doesn't really matter where you start. If you start in spirituality, if you start in biology, if you start in politics and history, they're all like spokes on a wheel pointing inward to a central truth. And so for me, as someone who's very interested in finding answers, the way that my approach to it is looking at what people who are very different thinkers, cultures, and disciplines have in common, right? That the intercourse of ideas. Because to me, it seems like the best way to get at the most truth, if that makes sense. Truth with a capital T.
Yeah,
it's going to be where the parallels are.
Yeah, it seems to make, well, it's a good place to start your investigation anyways, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the parallels that you found in your, and I'm assuming in all of your research, you've probably done quite a lot. It sounds like you're very well read. What are some of the ones that jump out at you that you're like, everywhere I look, this idea is like a common theme?
Definitely one consciousness. This idea that, I think people feel very separate a lot of the time, especially in the West, where we don't have a really communal society. We're very like rugged individualism and like, I'll do it myself kind of stuff. And if we look at stuff like literally religions all over the world, there's this idea that of oneness, right? And I don't think it's any coincidence that we find that in Hinduism, we find that in Christianity, we find that in Taoism, even when you think, what is that quote? From one came two, from two came three, and from three came all things.
Yeah, the 10,000, yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I think we're getting to the point where science is catching up with that idea when we talk about the possibility of like a quantum field or like a unified energy field, right? And so it's interesting that these things, and I see this, another theme that I see is so many things that our ancestors knew, that they knew intuitively, they knew through whatever means, spirituality, mysticism, we're now having the science to prove, which I think is so interesting. It's not until like 10 years ago that we really understood the benefits of meditation, and that's an age-old practice. So
yeah, very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, my favorite example is like the ancient Greeks who came up with the concept of the atom. It's like just using their minds. They were like, yeah, everything must be made out of some small, small building blocks. And it's like all these years later, yeah, there's atoms. It's like, holy crap, you guys figured that out with just your brains.
It's mind-blowing. And it makes me wonder too, like maybe we've become too reliant on technology in some ways, because these people did it without like a fraction of the technology that we have today. And I don't think we even understand how they knew what they knew. It's like the ancient Egyptians, right? We don't know how they built the pyramid. The distance between the bricks of a pyramid are less than a human fingernail. We can't do that with the technology we have today. We have no idea how they did that. And they didn't have freaking like bulldozers and cranes and anything. So it's really amazing that people back then knew things and built things and were aware of things that we are kind of aware of now, but we still don't know how they knew it. It was literally like, I guess as a Greek person, you just got lost in thought and you came up with an atom or something. I don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, they must have had time on their hands to think about this stuff as well, because, it's like, who has the time to think about what everything is made out of? Or like, is there a basic substance?
No,
like, yeah, but yeah, no, it's very interesting. And yeah, the fact that science is now lining up more and more with these ideas, yeah, it jazzes me up. Like, it gets me so excited, because it's like, I know it's true from experience. Like, I've experienced it, but it's really nice to be able to point to scientific data or research, peer reviewed, whatever, right? Because then it's like, this is just another angle on my experience, and it kind of fills in some of the blanks in case I want to know what's happening, or in case I want to understand the process. One book that did that for me was the Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you've heard of that book.
I've never heard of it. No.
I have a feeling you would love it. It's all about the bihemispheric brain. And
oh yes. Okay.
How it maps out to different philosophical and socio-political movements across the ages, and it's a wild book. For me, when I read it, it connected so many dots that before had been disconnected, and I was like, ooh. So okay, if you're looking for a good one, The Right Hemisphere is the master, and the left hemisphere is supposed to be basically the servant, right? That worries about logistics and works out the fine details, right? But in our society, this author basically suggests that the master has been usurped by the emissary, and the left hemisphere, which was always just supposed to be the servant, is now running the show. And he illustrates this very comprehensively with like all these split brain studies that have been done over the years, and he just ties it together beautifully. So but that's an example of science coming in, and for me, basically validating and contextualizing the mystical experiences that I've had and that other people have had.
Mm-hmm. So, and I love that you said servant and master, because I think of another way of looking at it is ego versus intuition. Mm-hmm. And Alan Watts has a quote, the ego makes a good servant, but a bad master.
Yeah.
And that's like exactly to your point. And I think you're totally right that we are kind of so focused on our left brain consciousness because it's productive, it's analytical, and when we think about the ego, it's very much about division and control. And it's not to say that the ego is bad. I think it's just really problematic when we become so identified with it that we forget there's this other aspect to life. There's this other, this intuitive aspect, this higher self. And with the ego, when we become like really identified with forms, then anytime someone questions something we believe and we're identified with it, it's perceived as a threat. So that's why Eckhart Tolle calls it form identification. And he thinks that it's the source of all of our problems in the world today, is being too left-brained.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that being a huge problem, if not the main one. Absolutely. And yeah, what you said about the ego is exactly in line with this book. I mean, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere brings a total complete package into being, and then the left hemisphere takes that complete package and breaks it down into little bits, right? It reassembles the whole picture into parts, and it's like, but there are no parts. Those are just ideas that are useful, right? But as you say, when you lose sight that these are just useful ideas and you think that they're real, that's when you get.
So there's a book, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's No Self, No Problem. And it was it was literally called, the subtitle was How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. And it's that idea exactly that the right brain, our intuitive mind, perceives things as a whole, like this sort of unified whole. And it has this sort of zoomed out perspective, like an eagle's eye view. And the ego, or the left brain, is very much into categories and division. And a lot of people in spiritual circles will talk about transcending the ego. And I don't know if that makes sense as an end goal. Like, I feel like we have that for a reason, you know, like, would we even be functional in a world where we could tell where we ended and something else began?
Nope.
You know, and so for me, I think it's about bringing these two things into harmony, which I feel like is what's happening on a collective level right now. When we look at what's happening globally, some people have said that we've been way too much in the left brain energy, the left brain consciousness. And what's happening right now as we, in the woo-woo circles, move into the age of Aquarius, is we're bringing these things back into harmony.
That's what we need. Yeah. Unification, not division, and integration, right? Not getting rid of the ego, but integrating the ego into the whole so that it becomes a functional part of yourself, right? Instead of this thing that destroys everything good in your life and makes you feel insecure all the time or whatever. But you said something really interesting, and it triggered something for me. Your experience in the train, you were seeing yourself from above at the same time as you were experiencing this, and it just made me think, do you think that maybe a part of the mystical experience is swing into the right hemisphere that's never occurred for many people? Like, if we're always living in the left hemisphere and all of a sudden you get shoved into the sort of right hemispheric mode of experiencing the world, which is very different. You're seeing yourself from above, you're seeing that everything is one beautiful, harmonious thing. Do you think that could be kind of a catalyst or a contributing factor to the mystical experience?
I think you're 100% onto something. I don't know. This is one of the things that I've been trying to look at, and specifically with that book, is figuring out what the relationship is between the mystical experience and what happens in our brain. And he said something very similar. There was a woman in that book who had a stroke, and the left part of her brain went offline. And for the 2 years that she was in recovery, she experienced something a lot like you did, of being in this state of bliss and harmony. And she said things were no longer black and white, like they didn't have hard edges. It was more like everything occurred on a spectrum. And she literally was in her right brain in that sense. So I think that that's totally part of it. And the other thing I haven't done a huge dive into yet, but I think the pineal gland is probably pretty central to whatever is happening when we do enter a mystical experience. But yeah, I think it absolutely has to do with shifting into right brain consciousness, especially because when we think about the things that put us in a right brain consciousness, like meditation or creativity or flow states, it's all happening over here. So I would be curious. I hope in our lifetimes someone comes out with the science that would speak to that kind of thing, because then, I mean, if we know what it looks like in the brain, we can teach people, right? And it would be wonderful if everyone could tap into that experience. It's like, and they're figuring out how to do this with meditation, with neurofeedback, where you can take a monk, and monks that have trained for decades in meditation can produce gamma waves, or gamma waves, which most of us will produce in spurts when we have moments of creative epiphany. But with a monk, they can have this sustained period of producing gamma waves. And so if you take what happens in a monk's brain and you stick it into a software, and then you hook someone up who's never done meditation before, and you have them try to, with their brain on a different screen. And so they're looking at monk's brain, my brain, and trying to get these things similar through the process of biofeedback, they can actually learn to enter into a state like that much more quickly. So you literally circumvent decades of practice, of meditative practice, and can attain a similar state. And so I wonder, with a mystical experience, with getting people into this state of bliss, of realizing that they're more than just their body. And I think, again, it comes back to bridging science and spirituality. If there was a way to do that, that would be revolutionary. You know, that would change the world. So
there's probably multiple ways to do that. I mean, I think your story to me is kind of an indication. Like you went to this meditation retreat, which, as you said, puts you in a right hemispheric sort of, it leans you to the right hemisphere. And then you have this experience of being outside your body, seeing yourself from above, which is all, again, quite symptomatic of right hemispheric, the way the right hemisphere views the world. And then you have this blowout experience where you're like, holy crap, what's real, what's not. And so I think there's definitely something there. And any way that you can shove yourself into that right hemisphere for the first time, it's going to feel like a breakthrough experience. I mean,
yeah,
most of us have never been there.
Yeah, it's a trip. I wonder what that looks like in the brain. There was another book, Stealing Fire, which is not a spiritual book. It's by Stephen Kotler. He does a bunch on like flow states and stuff. He wrote, I think, Rise of Superman was him, but he wrote about a study where Buddhist monks and Christian nuns, when they entered intense prayer and meditation, entire networks in their brain would go offline, and they're the ones that that are responsible for feeling division, so the ego. So I really do think it has something to do with right brain consciousness. I don't think anyone has it nailed down yet, but it'll be really exciting to see what progress on that front is made in our lifetimes.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great if you could go for an appointment and have these experiences like on demand almost, right?
Yeah, totally.
Just like unplugging.
Just go and plug in and have a mystical experience. That'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what do you think would happen to the world if more and more people had these experiences? I mean, do you think that the world's hunky-dory right now, or how do you feel about the state of affairs? And do you think that this mass awakening that you speak of is something that is needed?
I think it's needed, and I also think it's been prophesized. So talking about the Great Awakening, which was kind of hijacked by like QAnon, which was like a strange movement. But the idea of a Great Awakening had been around before then, before it had been hijacked by niche internet subcultures. And I feel like, so no, world is not hunky-dory. Everyone knows that the systems we have in place aren't sustainable. You had said that in your COVID series. And I think it's interesting that you called that back in, it was something like April. I went and I watched that series. And the WEF didn't talk about a great reset until recently, but it's on everyone's mind, the fact that our systems aren't sustainable. And if we keep going this way, humanity isn't going to be here in 50 years. Like, we all know this. And so I think with the spiritual awakening, there's a great spiritual awakening that's happening. And I have the graph that sort of illustrates, which I think is it seems like strong evidence to me that this is actually happening. I think more people are stepping into the state of realizing one consciousness manifesting as infinite possibilities, right? That we, this idea of unity. And I think because of that, we stand a chance at changing the direction that we're headed in, if that makes sense. And so I think more people are entering into these states of having mystical experiences, especially looking at the things that are kind of trending on the internet. And I think that it's indicative of a shift of going from this mode that we historically have operated in: fear, scarcity, division, control. Human beings have been pretty like bloodthirsty for most of our history. We've mostly just been like killing each other and like picking up the planet. So I think as more people shift out of that on an individual level, we're seeing it happen on a collective level. And I'm hopeful that the new age people are right when they talk about a golden age and an age of Aquarius, and that's what we're headed into. And I also think that it's a possibility, because if we look at there's a couple of books I've read recently. One by John Major Jenkins, where he looks at the astronomies of the ancient Hindus, the ancient, who is it? Hindus, Mayans, and there was one other, and Egyptians, looking at the astronomies of them, and how through his research, he's found that they all talk about this shift in humanity. It doesn't necessarily talk about it in terms of like left brain consciousness and right brain consciousness, but a shift in our collective consciousness, where we go from sort of like a darker period into a golden age. And he does it through astronomy. David Wilcock wrote something similar in Source Field Investigations, and he actually pinpoints the years 2012 to 2014 as our entrance into this new era. And it's interesting because these prophecies exist on either side of the Atlantic, between cultures that had no connection with each other. The Toltecs talk about it as the dawning of the sixth sun. So they have a similar calendar to the Aztecs and the Mayans. They're actually, I think, older than both of those. But if you think of that outer ring of the Aztec calendar is 26,500 years, and the Mayans divide that into 5, and the Toltecs divide that into 4, and then they line up every 5th year, and they both lined up on 2012. So there's like all these like weird astronomical coincidences that point to the era we're living in as a really pivotal age for humanity. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and if it was just these ancient prophecies and nothing else, I would say that's interesting. But
yeah,
if you actually pay attention to what's happening, it's like, holy shit, we are in the midst of it.
Yeah, no, and it like, how could it be coincidence, right? And that's the thing. I totally agree. If it was just prophecies, I wouldn't think anything of it. But combine that with what's happening in the world, the fact that I think more and more people are waking up to the fact that we have everything we need to create a paradise on Earth. Like, we are literally, this is weird to me, we are the smartest creatures on Earth. We are the only living creatures that can imagine something in our heads and then bring it into physical reality. Nothing else in the world can do that. That's what it means, in my opinion, to be made in the image of God.
Absolutely.
Religious connotation aside. Yeah,
yes.
We're these shapers of our reality. And for some reason, despite being all of this, humans are the only freaking species that has to pay to live and to eat. It makes no sense. Like, our systems are broken. And I feel like, where was I going with this? Our systems are broken. And I feel like this shift is us sort of stepping back into our birthright, because a lot of things in the world aren't working right now. And I think people are starting to poke holes in them. And even if we look at what's been happening recently, like politically, if we look at, have you been keeping up with Reddit versus Wall Street?
How could I not be? Grab them by the stonks, baby. That's
my God, like the memes are gold coming out of it. Yeah. And I feel like to me, that's indicative of what's happening too. I think COVID is indicative of the shift, and the fact that there's these movements that were fringe talking about a great awakening, about this shift in humankind. Wait, backtracking. So stonks, we were talking about, we were talking about, oh, right. So let's go there first. With what's happening between Reddit and Wall Street, the media makes it look like it's always red versus blue, right? And I think it's propaganda. I think that that's division, that's ego. It's about control, and often that that tension is used to make people who already have money more money, in my opinion. And I feel like with what's interesting about what we're seeing happening with this Reddit fiasco is these are people who come from both sides of the political spectrum, and really what they're doing is sticking it to the man, because it's never been red versus blue. It's always been the people versus the system, people
Amen.
versus the establishment, you know? So I feel like we're seeing in all different areas of life right now, we're seeing the way that people are waking up to the fact that it's not really us versus us, it's us versus our systems. And I think that if enough people can wake up to that, the world could look like a very different place by 2030, and maybe not like the WEF has been talking about it. I don't know. That's the other thing, is I feel like there's obviously a lot of conspiracy theories, I'm sure you're aware, around like the Great Reset and stuff. And some of them are certainly interesting, and I feel like there's enough evidence that maybe some are worth considering. But I feel like the last thing that we should want as a species is the 0.001% calling the shots for what the next the next leg of humanity, what our lifetimes is going to look like. And I feel like really the power needs to come back to people. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. Like what we're seeing is sort of like this epic power struggle that's playing out in all kinds of interesting ways.
Yeah, and unfortunately for us, many of us don't realize that we're part of the power struggle, and we don't realize what side of the struggle we're on, because many of us are still in that mindset of being divided, right? Mm-hmm. And like, you know, oh, socialists, or you know, whatever, right? Republicans. And you said so much in that last little bit, Chiara, that was like spot on in my opinion, and that warrants more conversation. Like, I don't even know where to begin. You nailed it, though. I think you know, I completely agree with you, and I think the whole Reddit stonks fiasco that's happening right now, I was just telling a friend of mine last night, that shows us that these systems are exploitable by everyday people. And I was telling my buddy, I said, imagine if we could do that politically. Imagine if we could engage, you know, the 50% of people who never vote and say, listen, we'll give you something to vote for, but you guys got to show up. And we had a movement that was kind of cohesive, not even that cohesive, because as you said, on Reddit, there's Republicans and Democrats in that subreddit. They're all taking it to the man, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, to me, this is like the start of the cracks are starting to show real good. And it's like people are starting to like get their crowbars into the cracks, and it's like, okay, here we go, right? But my question to you is, how do we prevent this? How do we prevent people who are experiencing this shift, maybe for the first time, don't quite know what's going on? How do we prevent those people from getting sucked into a QAnon type conspiracy? Because I've been reading a lot about this recently, and there's a huge overlap with New Age spirituality, mysticism, anti-vaxxers, QAnon. All these people are kind of getting sucked together. And I think that a lot of them, if they, you know, maybe watched your channel or read Eckhart Tolle or, you know, got into that first, they wouldn't be so easily duped into believing something like Pizzagate, or I don't know, COVID is fake and Bill Gates is tripping people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that you're right, there is a shift, but I'm worried that the shift is not altogether going in the right direction in some cases.
No, I think that's the opposite of the pendulum swing, right? That's like when you go kind of way too far off in the other ends. I don't know what the solution is for those people. I feel like we are what we consume. You know, people say we are what we eat, but we are the music we listen to. We are the YouTube channels we watch. We are above anything the people we surround ourselves with. And so when you get pulled into a community like that and it feels good and it feels validating, it's hard to tell those people they're wrong, you know? And so, I mean, I think the internet is a dangerous place for that reason. And I think that you see a lot of people, even outside of like fringe conspiracy political movements, but sort of taking, especially people with a spiritual awakening, sort of taking advantage of people's fears and desires. Because when you have a spiritual awakening, I would say you're pretty vulnerable. Like you don't know, your ideas of reality are now shaky. You're looking for answers. And if some dude on the internet promises that you can, like, you know, heal and manifest a Lamborghini or whatever, which is often what spiritual awakening ends up being for a lot of people, is it's like law of attraction and this sort of like superficial stuff. Like maybe you miss the point just a little bit. we see a lot of that, and that's part of the reason that like I wanted to start IdeaSexx, where people who are critical thinkers but open-minded can
That's a hard
have.
balance to walk, isn't it?
It is. No, and honest to God, and that was the thing, like I was so frustrated when I was first online, like looking for where are these people, because it seems like either people are completely dismissive of things like spirituality and mysticism, or they've gone way off into woo-woo land where like they believe all kinds of strange things. And I'm like, there has to be a middle ground here where people are open to these ideas, but are still like using their critical thinking abilities to wonder, to get to the truth of things. And a big part of that too, I think another piece of this is that people want to hold on to something like it's absolute truth. Like the QAnon people, you want to believe, especially when you don't know what to believe, it's easy to grab onto something and be like, this is what's real. And I think a huge part of being a critical thinker and being someone who's able to stay sort of grounded and neutral in situations like this is you hold them all as possibilities without necessarily latching onto anyone, you know? I don't know how to teach people that, especially like on a large scale. And so with something as like the internet, I think we're going to see those kinds of groups spring up and people are going to get sucked in. I think that the best we can do is put out our own message and hope that it resonates with enough people that, you know, maybe they don't go off into the land of Bill Gates as a evil space wizard from Draco that's gonna
keto lizard microchipped in.
Hook us up to a cloud for when they roll us over to central bank digital currency, whatever.
Yeah, well, I think the reason a lot of those things are successful is because they contain kernels of truth, right? Or things that are so plausible that it's like, well, if I can see that, then what's to stop this from also being true? And then it takes you a couple steps further, right? So I recorded a podcast. I think I'm posting it tomorrow actually, but it's with a gentleman who's a flat earther, and he reached out to me and wanted to chat. And that was a very interesting experience because at the end of the day, he said a lot of things that I agreed with him on. Like, people are being duped. There's individuals in the world who are keeping us in the dark and divided. And I'm like, yes. And then it's like, and the way that they do that is by telling us that the earth is a ball when it's actually not. And I'm like, okay, you lost me there, but I had you. We were on the same page right up until that point, you know? So I think as long as we can find common ground with people, and I think it's possible because we're all humans, I think ultimately that's the route forward for me, is trying to find common ground with everyone I talk to, regardless of whether they're a flat earther or someone who's like yourself, who's like 100% confirmation bias for me. It's like we're on the same page, we're into the same things. But it's like whoever I talk with, I got to find common ground, and especially with the people who are on a different page than I, because if we can find common ground, then we can work together.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's what it's all about, and being able to hold space for the differences, you know, like I don't know why people want everyone to agree with them. I feel like part of God source's spirit's gift to us is diversity. That's what gives life its richness and its texture, you know, so I think that's something that should be celebrated. And at the same time, it doesn't have to get in the way of the fact that, you know, people are people. And at the end of the day, for the most part, we all want the same things. You know what I mean? And it is important to find that common ground, especially in an age where we're so divided. So I hear you. And I also completely agree about the fact that like you believe one thing, and so you can take it like a step further, and how that sends people spiraling off into the deep end. And what sucks about that too is then, like, say you believe in something, and I really do think there's a lot of reason to believe in a global elite. I think that with the WEF, that's technically what we're seeing. But when you say New World Order or something that sounds like that, people are going to think that you're a fringe conspiracy theorist. I recently had a friend who indirectly accused me of being like an alt-right conspiracy theorist because I had been talking about the possibility of a global elite and what we were seeing with COVID. And it was really bizarre to me because like we had protested at Black Lives Matter together. We were born in the same hospital. We've been friends our whole life. And for her to believe that because I said something that I guess vaguely sounded like one of these fringe things, and then I got lumped in with them, that to me was startling. And I think that's really indicative of this divisiveness and how deeply entrenched people get into left versus right, red versus blue. And if you're not with me, you're against me, you know? Because you can believe in something like a global elite without believing that Bill Gates is a lizard person who's going to microchip us and hook us up to the cloud, you know?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but people hear one thing and they assume that they know what you believe, you know, and it's strange. And I can also see how that happens though, because people do start walking down this, they pick a rabbit hole and you start going down it, and some people go way down the rabbit hole and end up doing like fringe conspiracy stuff. So
yeah, I feel like that what you're describing there is also indicative of people being confused by language, you know, semantics. Like just because you use a word or a term doesn't mean that the other person knows what context or what your definition of that word is, right? Like talking about global elites, that's not even a conspiracy theory. We know that there's people out there, a very small segment of the population in the world that owns the vast majority of the wealth. That's documented. That's not a conspiracy theory. So to talk about elites, it's like, well, what does Chiara mean when she says elites? Maybe I should ask her instead of assuming that she's a freaking Pepe the Frog meme slinger or something, you know, like, but that happens a lot in people. The vast majority of disagreements, in my opinion, come from semantics and people not defining the terms that they're using, right?
I completely agree.
Or not understanding the terms that they're using. Like how many times are people, you know, like Joe Biden's a socialist. You fucking know what socialism is, my friend, because when you accuse a person like Joe Biden of being a socialist, you demonstrate to me that you've never read up about socialism. So why are you using that word? Like use a different word. Like he's a neoliberal? Sure, okay. But, you know, people are throwing these words around and they don't know what they're talking about. And it's like, how can we even have a conversation about this if you're describing something that is factually untrue? Like that's not socialism, right? So people get caught up in the words without really looking past the words at what the words mean or what they're intended to mean, you know?
And understanding what people are saying, right? It's like, oh, you're not part of my political party, regardless of what side you're on, you must be a communist. That's probably my favorite. Or, oh, you believe in a global elite, you must believe in a shadowy cabal of lizard people that are like satanic pedophiles. And I'm like, how did you get there?
There's a few steps before that are actually quite plausible, and that's why I rest, exactly. You know? Yeah.
And I feel like you said, there's a grain of truth in that really like crazy stuff. That's almost like the mythologized version of what's happening, you know? And so when people talk about, I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that, yeah, maybe the world is moving toward a technocracy, but maybe it doesn't look like being microchipped. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. And it's hard to sort of sift through all this bullshit and get to the truth, and you have to be really discerning. So, and I don't think anyone has definite answers. It's all just possibilities.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. I've told friends of mine, like, if they came out tomorrow and they told me the moon landing was faked, 9/11 was an inside job, there's lizard people on Earth and they're in charge of everything, and here's the proof, I'd be like, yeah, all right, I can see that. Like, it's a possibility. Yeah. I'm not going to rule anything out, but I'm not going to live my life as if it's true, because it's a fringe possibility in my personal opinion. Yeah. And so I'm going to go with what I think is more valid or plausible, but I'm not going to rule anything out, because again, in the last few years of my life, I've had enough experiences that tell me that anything is possible. So leave the door open, right?
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's been about an hour. What do you think? Time flies when you're having fun, right?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, I really enjoyed chatting with you.